My bad. I also did my presentation on how exercise affects depression. I focused a little less on adolescents and a little more on the general population and especially the elderly. Um, so the reason I decided to research this was because for most of my life, I was generally inactive, and this only got worse over COVID. But last year, I decided to join my school's cross country team, and I would say it changed my life because the world almost seems brighter after a run, if that makes sense. But um, I understand that this isn't scientific data, so I wanted to have a look at whether the literature supported the idea that exercise can be used to boost mood and potentially be a therapy for depression. So, without going into more detail than is necessary, exercise does treat depression. It does treat depression. The literature generally supports that exercise relieves depressive symptoms. In one particular study, adults who hit the recommended weekly exercise volume had significantly decreased risk of depression. But one thing I want to emphasize is that exercise isn't an end-all be-all by any forms. Doing exercise doesn't mean you won't get depressed necessarily, and not doing it doesn't mean you will. Also, some might get more of a mood boost out of exercise than others will, but its importance can't be understated. It's available to pretty much everyone, and the host of benefits completely outweighs the detriments for almost all people. So, with all these good things that exercise does, what I'm wondering is why is it that Americans are still overall so sedentary? You can see from this big chart right here that almost half of Americans didn't meet any sort of exercise recommendations whatsoever that the National Center for Health recommended us. And the reason why I think this is because Americans just don't have time. There's some stats on the screen. I'm not going to read them all out, but the big one that I want you to remember is that 74% of parents reported being too busy in their lives. Just like 3 out of 4 parents straight up say that they don't have time to exercise. And this is from the Pew Research Center. So it's not surprising that a lot of people can't fit exercise into their daily lives, no matter how much scientists keep telling them to do so. So I think that a potential solution to this is researching how do we maximize exercise's benefits while minimizing the amount of time we have to spend on it, which is really just how little exercise can we get away with. So I wrote a review paper on this, and we evaluated 2 factors in particular, which are intensity, how hard you exercise, and duration, which is how long you exercise. We used used papers that experimented on rodent and human models to see how much these factors affected the benefits of exercise. And this is my title slide, and the focus of my presentation is how can we balance exercise into our daily lives by minimizing the time we need to spend on it. And before I get into that, I'd like to address a major point, which is why not just take meds instead of exercise? And one thing I want to emphasize in particular is if you think the point of this presentation is to discourage you from taking the therapy you need, that's not the point whatsoever. Medications do work, and if they're prescribed to you, you should absolutely take them. Exercise is not a replacement for pharmacological therapies. So I'm not trying to say that meds are bad, because they're not by any means. But what I am trying to say is that they do have drawbacks. For example, a lot of people are just completely unresponsive to medications. Exercise could work for a lot of people for which medications don't work. Medications also have a lot of side effects. All of them you can read on screen. I'm not going to read all of them out. A lot of the side effects are pretty nasty. And for a lot of depression patients, they just have to live with the side effects because the alternative is worse. And the side effects just become the new normal, which might not be a life that a lot of people want to live. So exercise still holds value as a preventative, affordable measure that you could take with meds or without them. It's like asking, why would you wear a seatbelt if you still have airbags? We should use as many preventative measures as we possibly can in our arsenal to fight depression. So that's why I think exercise is still useful, even with the existence of medication. So the first study I used was a study conducted by Otsuka et al. It was conducted in 2016, and it studies intensity. They divided mice into 2 different groups. The 2 groups of mice ran at 2 different speeds. And then after they did their exercise session, they conducted the forced swim test on the mice. And the forced swim test is this thing where you basically put a mouse in a very large, deep bucket of water, and you see how long the mice struggles before it eventually gives up and just goes limp. It's not the prettiest test, but the idea is that it measures how much the mice are willing to persevere. And while this isn't a perfect one-to-one carryover for like depression, the idea is that the mice who are willing to swim for longer generally are less defeated. And this is seen as them having relieved depressive symptoms, or at least something analogous to that. And what's interesting about this study is that the mice who ran the less intense speed actually lasted longer in the forced swim test. This doesn't necessarily mean that less intense exercise is better. This is only a single study. More literature does need to be reviewed. And also the mice who ran the faster speed might just have been more tired. They might have been quote unquote happier, and that's why, but they still didn't last as long. Some other limitations of this study is that it does use rodent subjects. Rodent subjects aren't necessarily bad, but human subjects are always preferred. Not to mention, depression is uniquely a human disease. You can't say a rat is depressed. There could be a condition in a rat that's analogous to depression in humans, but you generally still want to use human subjects when possible. But of course, that wasn't possible with this study because you can't make a human do the forced swim test. It also uses 36 adult male mice, which isn't the largest sample size, and the extent to which the results would have differed with females or children is unclear. The second study I used is on human subjects, and it studies whether more volume is better in exercise. So it took a bunch of adults between the ages of 18 and 70. They divide them into 2 groups, one that did a lot of exercise volume and one that did lower amounts of exercise volume. In this study, it was found that more exercise volume does not necessarily reduce depression more. For example, exercising longer doesn't necessarily mean more relief of depressive symptoms. But I would emphasize that does not support and does not mean are very different things. Exercising longer might relieve depressive symptoms more. It's just that in this particular study, that wasn't the conclusion that was supported. So I think we have to be very careful when taking takeaways from such a small body of research. But one thing I want to emphasize is that you don't need 1 million hours of exercise every week to see its benefits. In both of the studies, increasing duration and intensity did not proportionally increase the effect that you got from the exercise. The general consensus might shift as we get more research on it, but the general bottom line is that a little bit of exercise does go a long way. You don't have to run 5 miles to see results, and a little bit of exercise is better than none at all. So in light of that, I would encourage all of us to make exercise a part of our daily lives. I would say that you want to make it a habit that you can actually see yourself continuing the rest of your life. Some people think that a 4 a.m. run is the only way to go, but you're far more likely to stick to a 10-minute jog every Saturday afternoon than waking up at 4 a.m. So even though the 4 a.m. run might quote unquote be better, it's less sustainable over time. And I would say that a program that you can actually stick to over time is far better. A little bit of exercise is better than none. I'd also encourage all of us to find a community or friends who we can exercise with. It can go a great deal in keeping us consistent and accountable. So yeah, exercise, it's a good thing to add into all of our lives. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Simon. I really like the quote that you had at the beginning, that the world seems brighter after you make a run. That I think paints the picture pretty vividly. As someone personally who has a lot of friends who are of the age where they're starting to be parents, I can report to you that it is very true that when they go out and exercise, that actually really has a massive impact on their mental health. And yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. So I'm kind of curious. In the beginning, you mentioned how Oftentimes Americans are saying that they're too busy to exercise. So I'm curious if there are any policies or changes that you would like to see made that can make exercise a little bit more accessible to people.
Yeah, I think Esther talked about a lot of gyms are making themselves free for teenagers. I think that's a very good start. I also don't want to go too far off the scope of this presentation, but a lot of employers are experimenting with shorter work weeks, and that would certainly give Americans a lot more time to get the exercise that they need to be getting, that they really haven't been getting.
That makes a lot of sense. It's that work-life balance. Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much.